Have you ever been bored out of your mind? Well, I bet this chemist has you beat. Niels Bohr was the famous Danish chemist that came up with the Bohr model. This model helps us to analyze and predict how atoms are going to bond with one another. Before we start drawing out a Bohr model, we first need to figure out what we're looking at and what we're looking for. Find any element on the periodic table. Let's take, for example, carbon. The total number of electrons in carbon is 6. We know this because atomic number equals protons equals electrons. And this works as long as we're dealing with neutral atoms. Okay, so back to carbon. Carbon may have 6 electrons total, but it only uses 2 of those to actually bond to other atoms. These special electrons are actually called valence electrons. Knowing how many valence electrons an atom has is extremely beneficial. This allows us to know exactly how many bonds an atom wants to make. And for example, if we didn't have these valence electrons, bonds would not happen and all life on Earth would cease to exist. So they're pretty important. There are a few ways that we can gain information about valence electrons, but for today's purposes, we're just going to use the Bohr model to figure it out. So now that we know what we're looking for, let's go through the steps of how to draw a Bohr model. First step is to draw circles kind of like you would a target. Each circle is going to represent an energy level, and energy levels are part of the electron cloud where electrons hang out. Each energy level, though, can only hold a certain amount of electrons. Our first energy level can only hold up to 2 electrons. So you might be thinking, okay, well, carbon has 6. Where do the other 4 go? Once an energy level is filled up, you just simply go to the next one. So once carbon has put in 2 of its electrons in the first energy level, we just go to the second energy level. Our second step in drawing out a Bohr model is to actually put in and draw out these electrons. So we usually do this just by using a circle. And for our first energy level, because it can only hold 2 electrons, we put 2 of our 6 carbon electrons in there. We move to the second one, where we add in those extra 4 electrons that carbon has. At this point, I'm done, and carbon's Bohr model is complete. What happens to that extra energy level, though? Because we drew 3, not just 2. Well, as we get bigger atoms coming in, those energy levels will fill up with electrons. Carbon is fairly small, things considered, so it's going to have a fairly small Bohr model. Let's look at a bigger atom like neon, which has 10 total electrons. Neon initially would fill up the first energy level with 2 of its electrons and then completely fill up the second energy level with its remaining 8 electrons. So where do valence electrons come in? We talked earlier about how valence electrons are special, and that's because they're the only electrons that will ever bond with other atoms. When we look at a Bohr model, the way that we can find these valence electrons is by looking in the outermost energy level. For carbon and neon, this actually ends up both being the second energy level. Now, carbon only has 4 electrons or valence electrons in that second energy level, and neon has 8 electrons or valence electrons in the second energy level. So does that mean that neon is going to bond more than carbon? Actually, no. The maximum amount of valence electrons an atom can have is 8. So if neon were to bond with another atom, it would put it over that nice 8 number. It's kind of like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Eventually, you've had enough mac and cheese and cupcakes and chicken tenders to basically fill you up for an entire week. That's how these atoms with 8 valence electrons feel. Carbon only having 4 valence electrons means that it has the ability to bond 4 more times. We'll talk in a later video about how these valence electrons actually want to bond. Okay, so the last thing. Remember that third energy level we drew? Well, there actually can be up to 7 energy levels total that an atom can have. That's a lot of electrons. For the purpose of this class, the maximum amount you'll ever have to draw on a Bohr model is 18. Past that, we start to get into things like orbitals, which are like extra rooms within the rooms that electrons can hang out with, and it's all confusing. I hope you enjoyed the video about Bohr models. Feel free to look at the practice video, and happy sciencing. I will see you next time. Bye!